The letter arrived under the seal of the previous reign, and the moment its contents were read aloud, King Charles III understood that his mother had not finished speaking even from the grave. Queen Elizabeth II had left behind an instruction so personal, so precisely aimed at the future of the crown, that it did not merely wound the king. It broke the quiet architecture of his entire monarchy. And buried beneath that instruction was a second truth, softer on the page and far more devastating in its meaning, one that no palace official wished to repeat aloud, because the Queen's final wish for Catherine was never a blessing. It was a verdict. Before we go deeper into what this really means, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update, because what happened in that room has not finished happening, and the second page of this story is already being written. To understand the scale of the wound, you have to understand where the letter had been hiding, and how long it had been kept from the one man who believed he had heard his mother's every final word. The document was not found among the formal papers, not among the state binders and legal codicils that lawyers had already inventoried. It had been placed in a drawer at Balmoral, folded once, sealed by hand, and left without any name on the front. It was not a will. It was not an amendment. It was a private communication addressed to the future, written in the uncertain hand of a woman who knew she was writing her last long thought. The handwriting shook slightly on the second line. That shaking was not weakness. It was certainty arriving too late to be overturned. When it surfaced quietly, the way the most dangerous things always do, discovered by a member of the household during what was described as routine cataloging, then passed to a senior advisor, then placed on a table in the king's private study, as if it were nothing at all. The advisor who carried it did not speak. Those who saw his face afterward said, he looked like a man who had just been asked to deliver a verdict against his own sovereign. Because that, in the end, was exactly what the letter was. A verdict, not against the crown, against the man who wore it. The first revelation was contained in a single sentence, and that sentence carried the weight of an entire reign. The Queen, in her final recorded wish, had instructed that Catherine, the Princess of Wales, be given a mandate that Charles had never once discussed, never once authorized, and never once imagined his mother would transfer to anyone but himself. She did not ask for it as a courtesy. She did not frame it as a request. She framed it as the final judgment of a monarch who had spent 70 years learning precisely where the real power of the crown resided, and she had decided that it resided, after her death, in the woman her grandson had married. Not in the title, she wrote. The title was form. The power was different. The power was the ability to hold the affection of the people and the respect of the institution at the same hour, without ever seeming to reach for either. And that, the Queen wrote, belonged to Catherine. This is the point where the story stops being about a letter and becomes about humiliation, because Charles did not read those words as a compliment to his daughter-in-law. He read them as an indictment of his entire reign, written in the only hand he had spent a lifetime trying to earn approval from. His mother, the one voice he had never been able to out-argue, had looked past him in her final hours, not toward William alone, but toward Catherine. The arrangement of power she described did not erase Charles. It simply placed him outside the circle of trust that mattered most. The crown would pass to him because the line demanded it. But the moral authority of the house, the thing that keeps a king warm in the cold centuries, had been quietly reassigned. The title remained his. The deepest power did not. Behind the closed door of the private study, the king did not rage. That was the part those who knew him found most unsettling. A man who has spent a lifetime being measured against a mother is supposed to shout, to slam a hand, to demand who authorized such a document to exist. Charles did none of it. He sat. He read the letter twice. Then he read it a third time, and on the third reading, he is said to have lowered the page and asked a single question that no one in the room knew how to answer without making everything worse. He asked who else had seen it. It was not a question about security. It was a question about survival. If the letter existed, it meant his mother had confided in someone. If that someone still lived, the king's authority had a rival standing in the shadows with a document that could redefine the succession of influence overnight. The silence that followed his question lasted long enough to become its own kind of answer. That silence is where the true battle began. Not in public, not with cameras, not with crowds, but in the space between a question and the refusal to answer it. The advisor finally admitted that the letter had been witnessed, sealed, and entrusted in a way that suggested the Queen intended it to outlive her silence. She had not wanted it opened at once. She had wanted it held. Held until the moment it could do what she intended it to do, arrive like an inheritance that could not be declined. Charles understood exactly what that meant. His mother had planned for him to feel this. She had arranged for the wound to be delivered at the precise hour when his own reign was still taking its first unsteady breaths. And she had done so, knowing the only thing he could not do was dispute the hand that wrote it. A king can argue with his courtiers. He cannot argue with the memory of a queen who has already been buried. The second revelation cut deeper because it was not about Catherine's role at all. It was about what the queen had deliberately not written. There was no mention of the king's own wife in the passage that defined the future of the women of the house. Not a single line about Camilla. Not a blessing, not a caution, not even an acknowledgement of the position Charles had fought for years to secure for her as queen consort. The omission was so total that reading it felt like standing in an empty room where every portrait had been taken down. Camilla's absence from the page was not an oversight. It was a signature in negative. The queen had written at length about Catherine, about her steadiness, her resilience, her capacity to carry the institution through its next generation, and had left the other woman entirely out of the frame. The statement sounded soft, the meaning was hard, and it landed on the king like a sentence he had already heard years ago, when the same mother had made clear, by silence alone, which bonds the crown would never formally bless. For Camilla, the letter was a wound she could not even protest, because protesting it would require admitting that she had expected to be named. She retreated into the role the palace has always given her when the ground shifts the smiling, unreadable figure at the edge of the frame. She attended the next engagement exactly as scheduled. She wore the right colors. She offered the right words. But those who watched her closely that week noticed that her hand did not rest easily, that her eyes moved toward Catherine more often than they had before, and that every public gesture now seemed to be carrying a private question. If the mother of the king had refused to write her into the future, then on what authority, exactly, did she stand beside the throne? A title can be conferred by law, a place in the story cannot. The title had been given. The place never had been, and now it never would be. What makes this more than a family quarrel is what the letter actually instructed, because the queen did not deal in sentiment when it came to the crown. She dealt in mechanisms, and the mechanism she had chosen for Catherine was one that had existed in the palace's unwritten book for generations, invoked only in the gravest of quiet moments. She had written that when the burden of the crown passed to William, Catherine was to be regarded not as a consort awaiting a ceremonial title, but as the custodian of the monarchy's continuity, the holder of the people's trust, the keeper of the house's memory, the one voice in the private councils whose opinion on the moral direction of the institution was to be treated, in the Queen's own words, as final. Not advisory, final. That single word changed everything. It converted a daughter-in-law into a co-authority. It converted a marriage into a governance. And it converted the king from the center of the succession into a steward standing in line, holding a throne that his mother had already, in her mind, passed over him to the next pair of hands. This is where the phrase final wish becomes the most dangerous legal adjacent concept in the entire affair. Because a wish is not a law, and that is precisely what frightens the palace. The letter has no constitutional force. It cannot remove a king. It cannot alter the line. It cannot compel Parliament, or the Privy Council, or the Church. And yet it holds the only force that ever truly governs a monarchy. The force of a queen's last memory, spoken across the gap of death into the ears of people who will now measure every succeeding reign against it. The palace knows this. That is why the first official response was not denial but delay. The statement that eventually came did not deny the letter. It did not confirm the letter. It said that matters of a private nature connected to the late queen remained private, and that the king's reign continued with the full confidence of the institution. Read it again and you will see what the lawyers saw. The word private was doing enormous work. So was continued. Neither answered the only question the public had begun to ask. Because the public, once it senses a withheld truth, stops asking polite questions and starts reading omissions instead. And the omissions began to multiply, each one a shutter falling in a house trying to hide its own light. The first change came on the official schedule. where a long-standing engagement involving the King and the Princess of Wales together was quietly and without explanation adjusted so that they would no longer appear on the same platform. The change was announced as routine reshuffling. No one at the palace used the word separation, but a schedule is a map of power, and anyone who reads maps could see what had been redrawn. Two figures who had once appeared as the seamless face of continuity were now being kept at a careful distance, as if the institution feared what a single photograph of them standing too close might be made to mean. It looked like logistics. It was choreography. Every public absence, every adjusted luncheon, every shortened carriage procession, every decision about who stood on what balcony and in what order was no longer about protocol. It was about fear. The fear that a single image, framed in the wrong way, could tell the whole story the palace was trying to bury. Then came the silence of Catherine herself, and it was the loudest sound in the entire affair. In the days that followed the letter's surfacing, the Princess of Wales appeared, and her appearances were flawless, gracious, apparently untouched. But she did not address the letter. She did not reference the Queen's final wish. She carried out her duties with the kind of serene precision that could mean either complete ignorance of the storm or complete mastery of it. And that ambiguity was itself a weapon. By refusing to deny the letter, she allowed it to live. By refusing to confirm it, she made it impossible to dismiss. She became, in the public's eye, the silent center around which every rumor now revolved. A woman who says nothing about a claim this monumental invites the world to believe she has reason to say nothing. Her silence was not an absence. It was a statement so controlled it might as well have been scripted by the Queen herself. Here is where you must decide what you actually believe, because the entire story now turns on a single question that no photograph can answer. Did the King beg Catherine to publicly set the record straight, or did he beg her to stay silent because the record, once established, could never be unstraightened? Think about it. If the letter were a forgery or a misunderstanding or a fabrication, the remedy would be immediate and total. Catherine would stand before the cameras and call it nonsense, and the matter would end in an afternoon. The fact that no such denial has been issued, no firm statement, no direct contradiction, no appearance staged specifically to kill the story, is the most revealing silence of all. The palace does not hesitate to crush a lie about the crown. It hesitates precisely once. When the thing it is being asked to deny is true. Type the word Catherine in the comments if you recognize that silence for what it is, because thousands of people are going to look at the next official statement and see only what they are meant to see. The confrontation behind closed doors was never meant to be witnessed, but glimpses of it have leaked the way light finds cracks in old stone, and each glimpse reinterprets the one before it. William is said to have entered the study after Catherine, and what passed between him and his father was not a conversation, but a negotiation conducted in the language of two men who understood they were no longer discussing a misunderstanding. The King wanted the letter contained. He wanted it characterized as a private sentiment, with no bearing on the present reign. William, according to those briefed on the aftermath, wanted something far more dangerous. He wanted the letter's importance acknowledged before someone less careful did it for him. He argued, in paraphrase, that the public had already chosen Catherine, had chosen her the way they had once chosen Diana, the way they had once chosen his grandmother, and that every day the palace pretended otherwise was a day it ceded control of the narrative to people who would not be kind. It was not disloyalty. It was the coldest kind of loyalty, the kind that tells a king an uncomfortable truth while looking him straight in the eye. Charles heard him, and the king did something that terrified the room more than anger ever could have. He agreed to nothing, and he denied nothing. He permitted his son to believe the letter would be treated with the respect of history, while privately instructing that its existence be treated, for the moment, as a private family matter to be managed rather than a public truth to be honored. It was a split between what was said and what was meant, and it was practiced with the ease of a man who has spent his entire adult life living inside that exact gap. To William's face, calm and restraint. To the household, control and delay. To the public, silence dressed as dignity. The king did not reject the queen's final wish. He simply began, hour by hour, to make it smaller, to shrink it from a mandate into a memory, from a memory into a rumor, from a rumor into something that, with enough patience, might be made to have never quite existed. That is how institutions bury things without ever using a shovel. But there was a problem with the king's strategy. And that problem sat at the very heart of what Catherine represents. The Queen's final wish was not, at bottom, about Catherine as a person. It was about Catherine as a symbol, the visible proof that the monarchy could survive the departure of its founding figure, that the affection of the people could be transferred, that the institution was not one woman but a living chain, and symbols of that power cannot be quietly shrunk. The more the palace tried to make the letter small, the larger Catherine grew in the public imagination. Every restrained statement made her seem more important. Every adjusted schedule made her seem more essential. Every camera that caught her doing the work, head bowed, hands folded, face composed, did the one thing the king could not afford. It confirmed, in image after image, that there was a figure inside the family who needed no title to be treated as royalty, and no letter to be treated as inevitable. The Queen had not invented Catherine's authority. She had merely described it. Describing it aloud into the historical record was the part the king could not bear. The historic precedent, once raised, made the whole affair feel less like a family dispute and more like a turning of an ancient wheel. There was a reason the Queen had written in the careful, unadorned prose of a sovereign, rather than the affectionate prose of a grandmother. She had been this figure once herself, the young princess, who became a symbol before she became a queen, the woman to whom a whole nation had looked for steadiness, while the men around her argued over procedure. She had watched governments rise and fall. She had watched prime ministers come and go. She had understood, earlier and more completely than anyone around her, that the monarchy's survival had never depended on the cleverness of its kings. It had depended on the constancy of its women. And in her final years, watching the institution she had held together begin to show the strain of its own contradictions, she had reached for the one instrument she still trusted. She had written a letter. And in that letter, she had handed the future, not to the son who would wear the crown, but to the woman who would carry what the crown could not, the faith of the people. That is not a sentiment. That is the redistribution of a kingdom's true wealth. Now ask yourself the question, the entire establishment is terrified, you will ask. If the letter is real, and if it says what the whispers claim it says, then who in the palace has the authority to suppress it? Not legally suppress legally, nothing can be done, because legally it binds no one. Morally suppress, historically suppress. The answer is unnerving, because the only people capable of suppressing it are the very people it diminishes. The king, his queen consort, the circle of advisors, whose own importance depends on believing that the future of the monarchy rests in the hands of the man currently wearing the crown. A document that says otherwise does not just insult them. It threatens the foundations of their authority. And people do not calmly hand over ground that the authority of their entire lives has been built upon. They redefine the ground. They reclassify the document. They call it private, and hope the word does the work that no argument could ever do. This is why the matter of the letter's custody became, overnight, the single most important question in the palace, more important than the king's engagements, more important than the state opening, more important than any ceremony the monarchy could stage. Where was it now? Who held it? Had it been returned to a vault, or was it sitting in some drawer of the king's study, waiting to be lost, the way inconvenient papers have a habit of being lost in institutions that have perfected the art of disappearance? The question matters, because a wish, once written, is only as powerful as the people who can prove it was written. If the only copy were to vanish, the story would not die. Such stories never die, but it could be reduced to rumor, to fantasy, to the kind of thing respectable people dismiss over dinner. The king, whatever his private pain, understood this with perfect clarity. The battle was never going to be won by disproving the letter. It would be won by making the letter's absence permanent, and then waiting for the world's attention to wander somewhere more comfortable. And yet the one force no sovereign can fully control kept intruding, the public. Because the public had already begun to do what the public always does when it senses a truth being managed. It had stopped trusting the photographs and started reading the spaces between them. Look at the images from the following weeks, and you will see it, the Princess of Wales, standing not in the center of the frame but slightly offset, as if the composition itself were trying to tell you something about where power now lived. Look at the ordering of arrivals, the positioning on balconies, the distance maintained in formal portraits. None of it is accidental, because in a monarchy nothing with a camera present is ever accidental. The palace was not staging unity anymore, it was staging control. And control, once it becomes visible as control, is already halfway to being lost. This is the moment to decide whether you will be silent or whether you will be part of the pressure that forces the truth into the open. Because the people running this carefully managed narrative are counting on your silence to finish the job. They are counting on you to watch the next smiling photograph and forget. If you believe a queen's final words deserve to be honored, not buried, then share this story, because every share, every like, every comment keeps the letter alive in a way no vault can contain, and it tells the palace that this is not a private family matter to be quietly absorbed. It is a public reckoning, and silence, in this story, is not neutrality. Silence is the exact cooperation the institution is praying for. The second confrontation differed from the first in one crucial way. This time it was not between father and son, but between two women whose entire futures had been placed on opposite sides of a single page. Catherine and Camilla were, on the surface, models of decorum. They attended the same events. They made small, careful conversation. They offered each other the precise courtesies the moment required. But the temperature in any room containing both of them had changed, and everyone of rank could feel it. Camilla's position, secured at such cost and over so many years, was now, for all the legal permanence of her title, being compared in the public mind against a younger woman the late queen had apparently anointed. No amount of smiling could end that comparison. No number of royal waves could answer it. Every appearance was now an unspoken contest, and in that contest the queen consort was defending not her crown. Hers was secure, but something more fragile. The sense, never spoken, that she was the woman the previous reign had overwritten. That the institution had accepted her because it had to, and had honored Catherine because it wanted to. And Catherine, for her part, walked through all of this with an almost unnerving stillness. The stillness of someone who has understood that the most powerful thing a woman in that house can do is withhold. She did not campaign. She did not leak. She did not reach for the letter's authority. She simply let the absence of denial do the work, day after day, frame after frame, and in doing so she confirmed the Queen's judgment without ever once having to say a word in its defense. It was, whether she intended it or not, the single most disciplined exercise of soft power the modern monarchy has ever witnessed. The Queen had not chosen her for nothing. The Queen had chosen her because she could carry a weight like this without dropping her smile. The turning point came when the first serious figure on the outside gave the story the one thing the palace had been fighting to prevent: legitimacy. A former senior figure, someone who had once stood close to the throne and understood its private machinery, went before a microphone and said, carefully, that it was entirely plausible the late Queen had left private guidance about the future of the house, and that such guidance would not have been written lightly. That was all. 3 measured sentences, nothing confirmed, nothing denied. But the effect was the same as if the letter had been read aloud on the evening news, because the palace's entire strategy had rested on the pretense that the whole thing was beneath serious discussion. The moment a serious person discussed it seriously, the pretense collapsed. The story stopped being a rumor circulating in the dark and became a question put to the crown in the daylight. And once a question reaches the daylight, it cannot be waited out. It must be answered, or it must be survived. The palace chose, as it so often does, to attempt the second while pretending the first was coming soon. And still, through all of it, the king's public face held. That is the cruelest detail of all. A man can be shattered behind the walls of his own study and still stand before the nation with his chin raised. Because that is exactly what a lifetime inside the institution trains him to do. Charles appeared. He read the words placed in front of him. He shook the hands, accepted the flowers, made the small remarks. But those who knew him said the performance had acquired a new, almost mechanical quality, as if the man inside the uniform had stepped back a pace from his own body and was watching himself go through the motions. The letter had not changed his title. It had changed something the title cannot protect. It had changed how he understood his own place in the story his mother had written, and a king who doubts his place is a king. carrying a private grief that no ceremony can touch. The institutional machinery, meanwhile, turned its attention to the only question it could actually control: the timetable. Who would be seen next? When? Beside whom? The sudden emphasis on family unity events was not a coincidence. It was counter-programming, staged to give the impression that nothing had changed, that the house remained as it had always been, that the letter was a private matter already receding. But counter-programming, by its very nature, concedes the point it tries to deny. You do not stage unity unless unity is in question. You do not manufacture closeness unless distance has been noticed. The very effort to show that nothing had changed became, to anyone watching closely, the strongest evidence that everything had. The Crown does not perform for an audience it does not fear. What the public has been shown is therefore only half the story, and the half that has been chosen for them. The other half is still behind doors, still in a study, still resting in whatever drawer or vault now holds the last recorded judgment of Queen Elizabeth II. And that other half is where the real shift in power has already occurred, invisibly, irreversibly. The title remains with the king. The line of succession remains unchanged. The constitutional order stands. But authority is not a law. Authority is belief. And belief, in the space of a few extraordinary weeks, has been quietly transferred. Not from the king to Catherine. That would be too simple, too easy to contest. Belief has been transferred from the present to the future. From the man holding the crown to the generation waiting behind him. From the reign that is happening to the reign that the people have already, in their hearts, begun to anticipate. The queen did not depose her son. She did something subtler, and in the long run far more complete. She made him historical while he was still alive. That is the shift the script's final act must confront, because no resolution here will be clean. There are reports unconfirmed, fragmentary, and delivered in the nervous half-sentences of people who want to be believed, but not quoted, that the letter recovered from Balmoral was not the whole document, that it ended mid-thought, that the final page, or perhaps the final paragraph, was set apart from the rest, sealed a second time, and entrusted to a person whose name has not yet entered the public record. If those reports are true, and the palace's refusal to describe the letter's length or condition is itself a kind of confirmation, then the world has seen only the beginning of the Queen's final communication. The part that described Catherine was, perhaps, only the opening. The part that named names, fixed conditions, or set a deadline was deliberately held back, separated from the rest, so that even the king, reading alone in his study, would know that his mother had kept from him the one thing he needed most to know, because the deepest fear in that house has never been that the public might learn the truth. The deepest fear is that the truth might not yet be finished. A queen who would write one letter would write another. A woman careful enough to seal a wish against the future was careful enough to stage its delivery, to time its release, to arrange that its full meaning arrive in waves rather than all at once. And so the story does not end with the king shattered in his study, surrounded by advisors who cannot answer the one question that matters. It pauses there, on the edge of something larger. Somewhere a final page sits inside a seal that has not yet been broken. Somewhere a hidden name waits to be read. Somewhere, the last instruction of the longest reigning monarch in British history is still waiting for its appointed hour. The question the viewers must carry into the next chapter is not what the letter said. It is what the letter still says, what remains unread, unconfirmed, and unspent. Because a king can withstand his mother handing the future to another woman. He cannot withstand the moment that future woman's mandate is actually invoked, in public, against the weight of his own silence. That moment is coming. It has a date that no official schedule will ever print. It has a name that has not yet been spoken. And when it arrives, the study, the throne, and every carefully staged photograph will mean nothing against the simple act of a sibyl being broken, and a final page being held up to the light. The real battle, in other words, is not over. It has not even truly begun. The king is not the last person who will be shattered by this story. He is only the first. And so we leave it here, on the edge of the next revelation, because what follows is a story that deserves its own telling, its own witnesses, and its own reckoning. If you have made it to the end of this, you are no longer just watching. You are part of the record now. Which side of it you stand on is decided by what you do next. Comment the word Catherine if you believe the truth is bigger than what we have been shown. Share this if you refuse to let a hand, still writing from beyond the grave, be quietly folded away. And subscribe, because the next page is already waiting, and when it breaks, you will want to be among the first to see what the Queen really hid in the final line she never meant for her son to read alone.